Well, hello xenographers everywhere and welcome to another episode. Today we're going to look at some fast 50mm kit lenses from Yashica, Nikon and Pentax. In the late 70s and early 80s, the SLR boom was in full swing and most manufacturers had more than one SLR to offer. They usually came with a 50mm f1.8 or f2 kit lens, and so versatile were they that for many casual photographers it was the only lens they ever used. These lenses are jacks of all trades. They have short minimum focus distances, there's plenty of background blur if you want it, they're not too long for the occasional landscape, and they're pretty good for portraits too. They're light and compact as well, and perhaps best of all, you can often find even the nicest ones for less than 50 quid, sometimes much less. So, without further ado, let's check them out. Let's look at the Yashica ML 50mm first. This lens was sent to me by viewer Derek Holmes, so many thanks for the loan, Derek. It's a very nicely made lens. It's almost all metal, although I think the aperture ring may be plastic, and it stood the test of time well. Minimum focus distance is 50 centimeters and apertures run from f2 to f16. While I've never used Yashica lenses before, I have heard lots about them, so I was expecting this one to be pretty nice, and as it turned out, I wasn't disappointed. I do like the way it represents colour. Saturation is strong, but not too strong. Colours have energy and depth, but they're not pushed up so far that they become overwhelming. They're energetic but restrained, strong but gentle. There's a balance to these colours, and they've clearly been finely tuned. It modulates colours only slightly, pushing them just far enough to give a bit of pop before colours become over-exaggerated. This lens knows exactly how far to go. Sharpness is good, and it compares well to other similar lenses of the time. It's not the sharpest lens in this class, not as sharp as the Carl Zeiss Jenner 50mm Pancolar, for example. Few lenses are, but it's more than acceptably sharp, and it certainly never feels soft. This is a lens with inherently good contrast, and it demonstrates a very strong range of tones. It creates punchy images in both colour and black and white. In fact, to my eye, it seems to work particularly well in black and white. Images have strong blacks, whites and shades of grey, and this seems to be an area in which it really excels. It's a fairly fast lens with a reasonably close minimum focus distance, so there's plenty of blur on hand if that's what you're after. Shooting wide open at 50 centimeters from the subject gives us plenty of the blurry stuff, as much as anyone could decently require, and at this distance it has a very soft, very pleasing quality. It stays nice as you pull back a bit too, although at certain distances and under certain conditions it can behave a little less well, particularly if specular highlights are in the near background. Those point light sources seem to jostle and bump each other, to stack up on top of each other in a way that can seem a little harsh and untidy. Shift the distances just a little though, and things become much more pleasant, and overall, blur from the lens is nice. This is a great little lens, a really solid performer with good colour, strong contrast, and a usefully short minimum focus distance. It costs from around £20 to £40, and at that price, what's not to like? The next lens is a bit of a sleeper, a lens that's sometimes looked down on as being somehow less than other lenses from the same manufacturer, but I think that's a little unfair. It's the Nikon Series E 50mm f1.8, one of the many lenses made for the auto exposure only Nikon EM cameras of the late 70s, early 80s. It's not quite as beefy as other Nikon lenses, and some of its parts, the focus and aperture rings for example, are made of plastic, although most of it's metal. The minimum focus distance is 60 centimeters, not quite as close as I'd like, and on this one the focus ring turns smoothly and freely. Apertures run from f1.8 to f22, and the adjustment ring again turns freely and cleanly. I've used this lens on film and it worked very nicely, delivering crisp, clean images, but I wasn't sure that character would transfer to digital. In the event though, I needn't have worried, it works very nicely indeed. It's a cooler lens than the Yashica, and it's slightly shifted towards the blue end of the spectrum, a characteristic that I rather like. Its colours seem a little more pumped up than the Yashica too. They're vibrant and strong, saturation is strong, and colours have plenty of energy and punch. They're not over the top, but they're certainly strong and resonant, and in certain shots we get a filmy kind of look, reminiscent of a slide film. Those strong colours need good contrast to stand out, and this lens can supply it in abundance. It's a very contrasty lens, and that means it can make really nice black and white images too. In fact, it's one of the nicest lenses I know for black and white. Images are really strong, very detailed and very striking. They're rich and deep, almost tangible, a riot of black, white and grey, and quite a bit nicer than the rather fancier and more expensive Nikon AI 50mm f1.4 I tested a few months ago. I think black and whites are an area where this lens really delivers the goods. That strong contrast does wash out if you're shooting into a strong light source, though it does give you some pretty groovy flares as compensation. It has a very high resolving power. It's difficult to tell exactly, but to my eye it seems just that bit sharper than the Yashica. Edges seem that little bit tighter, detail just a little cleaner, and images are clean, crisp and detailed. This lens can make plenty of background blur, and while it's most evident close to the subject, it persists up to moderately long distances where it will still give some separation. But there's a caveat here though, because while blur is very smooth up close, it's less well controlled at longer distances, becoming rather busy and nervous. Get the distances just right and it's lovely. Get them wrong and that unsweet spot will emerge. Overall though, it's a very nice little lens, and a rather underrated one too. Sellers often ask around £100 for this lens, but that's aiming rather too high. On auctions they tend to go for around £40 to £50, which for a high quality 50mm with very good contrast and sharpness and great colours seems a very good deal indeed. Finally, a rather older lens than the other two, dating to around 1960. It's the Pentax Auto Takumar 55mm f1.8. The build quality on these lenses is legendary. It's all metal, so it's a fairly heavy old thing, and despite having been rather neglected before it came to me, it's still in really nice order. Focus and aperture rings turn cleanly and smoothly. Minimum focus distance is 45 centimeters, and apertures run from f1.8 to f16. That beautiful engineering makes this lens a delight to use, and it makes some very beautiful images. I love the way it renders colour. Saturation is strong and colours are rendered boldly, not quite turned up to the max, but not far off. They're direct, rich and full, but entirely in the Takumar tradition, there's a subtlety and a delicacy too. Colours are never oversaturated and they never seem too strong. I find it a very pleasing look, and I don't know of lenses from any other manufacturer that can do it. In most situations, contrast is strong and it makes bold and punchy images in both colour and black and white. In fact, I really like its black and white images. It's one of those lenses that works particularly well in monochrome, rendering blacks, whites and greys with sensitivity and delicacy. Contrast does wash out if you catch a light source at the wrong angle, but shielding with a hand or a lens hood prevents it. Background blur is just lovely, and expensive rarities apart, it's some of the nicest, most consistent, best controlled blur I've seen from any vintage lens. Almost all vintage lenses have an unsweet spot, a point where the relation of camera, subject and background distances produces an unpleasant harshness or nervousness in the blur, which can sometimes detract from a shot. But unlike the Yashica and the Nikon, with this one, although the character of the blur changes as distances change, I couldn't find any point where it actually becomes unpleasant. A rare quality indeed in a vintage lens. This really is a lovely lens, and it gets even lovelier when you consider that they can often be found for around £30. A bargain indeed. So there we are, 3 fantastic fast 50s from the film days. The Yashica makes beautifully balanced, delicate images, while the Nikon has great contrast, strong colour and makes powerful black and whites. But perhaps the best all-rounder here is the Pentax. It has unique colour, strong black and whites and lovely soft background blur. That would be my choice, but you, of course, might think differently. So, that's it from me for now. Please don't forget to like, subscribe and ring that bell before you go. And if you like the content on this channel and you'd like to help it to grow and develop, you can do that at patreon.com/Zenography. As ever, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time for some more Zenography.